Welcome and thank you for joining the New America Fellows Program for a discussion of Tremaine Lee's new book, A Thousand Ways to Die: The True Cost of Violence on Black Life in America. I'm Ted Johnson, a class of 2017 New America Fellow, and I'm a senior advisor leading the US at 250 initiative here at New America. Before we start, just a couple of housekeeping notes. If you have questions during the event, please submit them through the Q&A function to the right of the Slido box, and we'll address them in the second half of the event. And second, copies of A Thousand Ways to Die are available through our bookselling partner, Solid State Books. And you can find a link to buy the book on this page. Just click Buy the Book. So it's my pleasure to introduce Tremaine Lee. I'm just going to give a quick bio. The brother's accomplished a lot in his career. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner and an Emmy award-winning journalist, author, and MSNBC contributor. He's the host of the Into America podcast, where he explores the intersections of race, power, and politics. And he was a class of 2016 New America Fellow and is bringing this book to the public now after many years working on it. So it's good to see you, man. Welcome, and looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, good brother. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, sir. I've been reading the book over the last couple of weeks here, and I'll be honest with you, the first few pages there are they're still they stay with me most because it's the way you sort of set up the argument of the book, the thesis of the book, and it does it in a way that immediately makes it feel urgent, personal, and broader than just a conversation about guns, but about how trauma impacts Black life in America. So I wonder if you could share with folks the sort of opening vignette in this book and just sort of how that experience brought you to how you bring that to the conversation around Black life in America and gun violence.
Yeah, thank you for that. The opening scene is July of 2017, 2 years after I started writing a book about the true cost of gun violence in terms of actual dollars. That was the initial conception of the book. And so 2 years in, I have out of nowhere a heart attack, a widowmaker. So more than 95% of my left anterior descending artery had been blocked by a blood clot. I didn't have any family history, no warning signs, nothing that would indicate that this could happen to me. But there I was fighting for my life, like quite literally. It felt like I wouldn't say an out of body experience, but my entire like my life was separating from my body, and I could feel that. Um, and in the days and weeks after the heart attack, as I was trying to make sense of what happened to me, both physically but also just emotionally grappling with facing my mortality like that, my 5 year old going on 6 year old daughter Nola started asking me curious questions, as 5 and 6 year olds will do, about how and why. And I had to really dig deep and be vulnerable and be honest about what it was that was actually bearing down on my heart, with no physical issues necessarily, and a clarity set in to where
Mm,
I understood what was bearing down on my heart was a career chronicling very up close Black death and trauma, and survival, but also a family history going back 100 years, of this inherited trauma of gun violence that we've experienced and passed down generation by generation. And so what started out to be a work about the literal cost of gun violence as a way to speak to what families and communities are paying every single day, ended up being a book about the cost that I almost paid, as a way to speaking to what it means to have a physical manifestation of the trauma we carry.
mm. Right. And so I want to pull on that a little bit, the physical manifestation of inherited trauma.
Hmm.
And that's, I think that that's the one of the elements of your book that make it stand out from everything else out there about race and gun violence is this connection here. Can you talk a little bit about that inherited trauma? You talked about your family from Jim Crow, Georgia, and some of the violence they encountered there through the Great Migration. Can you sort of take us through that progression of your family that sort of connects to this inherited trauma piece you mentioned?
Yeah, I want to start more recently and then go back.
Okay.
So growing up, I always heard the stories of how my grandfather, Horace, was murdered in 1976, 2 years before I was born. Um, I always heard about the pain and the absence and what it meant to lose him so violently. My mother is one of 8 children, and so this big family without their patriarch. I always knew that growing up, and that was a certain kind of weight to bear. Um,
Mm,
but it wasn't the first murder in my family. In researching for this book, I went back to where my family first settled in Georgia, in rural Jim Crow Georgia. And in 1922, my great grandparents, along with my grandmother and her older brother Cornelius, they were all tenant farmers. So they worked land that they would never truly own. And one day, Cornelius was sent off to run errands, and he ended up being shot and killed in a neighboring sundown town. And for many people in this room, we've all heard of sundown towns, and I'm guilty of somehow thinking it was just colloquial, like
mm,
a kind of town. Just be careful if you're black because it's just dangerous. They don't like black folks. But contemporaneous accounts and newspaper accounts from the day speak to how the white men of this community literally came together and had a meeting, not to pass a law, but just to say, we need to keep these niggas out, basically,
mm,
literally saying this. And this is where Cornelius was shot and killed. Soon after that, my family joins millions of other Black Americans in the Great Migration, tossing themselves in the waves northward. And so they went from Dodge County, Georgia, to Philadelphia first, and then over the bridge to South Jersey, where I'm from. And in 1951, another of my grandmother's brothers, McClinton, just a teenager, was shot and killed by a state trooper under the kind of circumstances that are eerily reminiscent of Mike Brown and Ferguson and all these cases of young black men killed under questionable circumstances. And in this case, I'll never forget discovering the headline from the newspaper, Trooper's gun kills youth. And it's so devoid of humanity. And it's just like this, the gun just had to
the
kill the
gun,
youth.
right.
It was just the gun. Um, and so to think up to that point that my great grandparents had lost 2 sons to murder, one in the Jim Crow South, and then one in the so-called Promised Land of the North, where many Black folks found more opportunity, certainly, and less vicious violence, but still found violence, racialized violence nonetheless.
Mm,
And then 25 years later, my grandfather, Horace Worthington, is killed. So my grandparents had an apartment in Camden, New Jersey, that they were renting out. And a guy came and left a deposit for $160. That was how much the rent cost, $160. And they disappeared for many weeks. When he came back, wanted his money back, my grandfather told him it's non-refundable and I'll see you in court. And so a court date was literally set. But instead of meeting my grandfather in court, he came back to the family home and shot and killed my grandfather. And so again, the tally of the cost that my family had paid, generation by generation, from the Jim Crow South to the migration to the early 70s, right, as we're wrestling our way through the civil rights movement, right, the tail end of it.
mhm,
But then still, 20 years later, in 1996, my stepbrother was murdered in Camden, New Jersey. A girl shot him in the back of the head. And then in the early 2000s, I had a cousin who was murdered in Lang City. And, a year or two later, his brother was involved in a botched robbery turned murder. So he spent the rest of his life in prison. And so grappling with the true burden that violence, gun violence in particular, has played on my own family as I was trying to wrestle with my own mortality. And it kind of forced me to widen the aperture on what violence actually is. There's the violence of the trigger, certainly, but then there are also a slew of systemic forces that act as another kind of violent force, pushing us so often towards early death, and what it means to carry that in your hands and your heart. And so, again, the book changed relatively dramatically with my own personal shifts, but a clarity set in on what it means to carry, all of that weight.
mm. As you were talking about your family, I have similar experiences in my family. Uncles yanked up by the cops, or cousins killed due to gun violence outside a club, or and it and it seems like gun violence is a closer problem for more Black people than it is for the rest of the country. It seems like it's disproportionately affects us. And so, as I really see your book as kind of it's like a history of the relationship between Black America and guns, from before we became Black Americans to present day. And I want you to walk us through that history. But first, I want you to describe epigenetics, if you will, the because I think once we walk through the history, understanding this concept, we understand that the history isn't just the story that we tell our children, but it's also the blood, the experiences, or the biology and the experiences that we pass down to them. So, what is epigenetics, and sort of how does it connect this inherited trauma plus into real social and physical manifestations?
Yeah, the idea of epigenetics is that once you experience a certain degree of trauma, it's literally coded in your DNA. It begins to reshape your genetics, and you pass those on to your children. And so, the idea of fight or flight and cortisol levels and how you're responding internally has been already manifest from what your forebears have experienced, your ancestors have experienced. And I've been thinking about this idea a lot in the physical form, this idea of epigenetics and what story, what narrative is literally coded into us and what trauma. But there's also, to me, a kind of psychic or ethereal residue from what we've experienced from the very
Mm,
beginning. And so it's easy for us to understand to some degree the violence of the Jim Crow South. And I will tell you now, having read through all as many accounts as I possibly could from that time in the Jim Crow South, it's even more violent than you could imagine. Like we're thinking
mm,
about the lynchings and the braided rope, but the killing, the day-to-day killings, not just the racialized ones, white on white, black folks, black. It was a lawless, violent time.
mm,
Even before the enslavement and even before Reconstruction and then the redemption period that pushed us back into slavery and Jim Crow and all that, um, I discovered something that I couldn't fully, I never fully understood before, the relationship of the gun in the slave trade. And so there's something called the guns for slaves cycle. And so many of us understand or thought we understood how enslaved Africans came to be, that they were just a natural byproduct of these regional conflicts. And there were Europeans involved in the trade who just found an apt and able labor force to supply the needs of this growing Western world. When in fact, as gun technology is rising in the early 18th century, European powers begin sending massive, massive shipments of guns and gunpowder to West Africa. And this was to ply regional African powers with guns to create more instability in war, to create more enslaved people. And the abolitionists of the time noted that it wasn't the slave that created the war, it was the war that created the slave, right? And so
mm,
the cycle was very intentional to keep them unstable, keep the footing loose and the war, churning to create more enslaved people. And so this notion that we're forced out of Africa with the muzzle of a rifle at our backs, and then we arrive at what for them would be the hell of the Western world with more white men and more guns, and a system where the violence is not just codified, but it's the violence that keeps the entire society, structured the way it is, right? It's
mm,
maintained through that
mhm.
violence. And so the idea that when you look at the deepest dynamics, the truest dynamics of Black people guns, it goes before we were even Americans, and that it was so central is just unnerving to then see decade by decade, generation by generation, crossing geography and time, that we are still bound in so many ways to the violence of the gun and the actual gun itself.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's just such a fascinating concept. And I wonder if, and so maybe this analogy may be a little off, but I wonder if the reason it can be passed down is because there's also a survival component to it as well. And so it reminds me kind of, I mean, frankly, of like sickle cell anemia and the trait. It's more prevalent in Black folks because it's harder for a sickle cell blood cell to be infected with malaria than a
Yeah,
normal blood cell. And so Black folks develop this sort of resistance to malaria. But the flip side of it is sickle cell is a deadly illness
right.
and a painful one while alive. And so I wonder, is there a corollary here between how trauma works in the Black body related to violence generally, but guns specifically, that both makes us more resilient, but also makes us more susceptible in other ways because of what's been passed down?
Well, I think this notion of resiliency, and I heard this from a woman in New Orleans about 10 years ago, around the 10th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. And I talked about how, I, like many of us, talk about how resilient the community is and resilient people are. And she said resiliency is not a natural state, that you're
Mm,
expected to bend and bend and bend to the verge of breaking and all of that damage being done before you fall apart. And when I think about the violence that Black folks have experienced, that we've experienced in this country, um, and this idea that it's become so routine, and anti-Black violence in particular is so routine, and Black bodies being destroyed is so routine, that it's you become sort of not immune to it, but you have no choice.
right.
And through that, this idea that the gun has been used as a cudgel to keep us in our place if we dare to live too fully or too freely. And so there is a chilling on our imaginations, because if you we've known what happens is it's our ambition that has been dangerous in this country, right?
Mm,
It's our
hmm
ambition that has got us lynched. It's our ambition that has got that we
mm,
experience this very violent economic dispossession, that we've lost so much land for daring to be as full American citizens as possible. Um, but then when you get into these spaces where you have to be hyper vigilant, you have to keep your emotions in check, because there is so much violence from the police baton, from the neighbor bullet, from all those spaces. I think it does. It shapes and shifts the way we move through the world, the way we interact with each other, let alone what we're holding inside of us so coiled up, the stress
hmm
and anxiety, to where it even manifests. And I suffer from this, where it even impacts your sleep, where the average Black person is getting like an hour and a half to 2 hours less sleep because of the
mm,
stress and because of how we experience this country to this day. When I think back to my pre-heart attack days, the way I was with coping with what I was feeling would be to throw myself even further into the work, or as many journalists were drinking, or when you're young,
mm.
you're chasing things around, you're moving around, shaking and baking, trying to distract yourself for a
Right.
moment what you're actually feeling. Um, and I often think, and this is parallel to what we're saying, kind of, I think about going back to the idea of epigenetics and how over time you learn to adapt. I think about the study I came across many years ago, and this isn't a book, but I just been thinking about this. They had this, a maze, and the walls were electrified, and the mouse would come in with a long tail, and it zaps the wall, and it zaps the wall, and his tail got shorter. And after a while, the offspring started to develop shorter tails,
Mm,
right? Because you're so
right.
used to that. And in some ways, I feel like Black Americans, we've been moving through this society with these electrified walls being zapped.
Mm.
And so how do you adapt to survive? What does that actually look like? Um, and I think we see every single day what that looks like.
Wow, that's a powerful visual. And so okay, so we're talking about Europeans with guns working deals with folks in Africa to kidnap people and whisk them away for a life of slavery. They're met with guns once they get to plantations in the Caribbean and in North America and the United States. And then guns are used to patrol and police their behaviors both during slavery and then post-Civil War by essentially a police force created to sort of create barriers between Black folks and the rest of society. And then there's the sort of police violence and that sort of thing, and then the sort of vigilante violence is accompanying all this. And while this is happening, though, guns are more prevalent in America, and Black folks are increasingly segregated in tight places because of the Great Migration, moving out of sort of the very large rural areas of the South into more congested and tighter areas of the North. So how does this play in now you have majority Black neighborhoods, guns, lower such socioeconomic status and opportunity, and with this trauma they're carrying with them from generations of violence at the hands of guns, at the hands of people with guns. That mix seems poisonous, and that seems like what you're describing here. How does segregation plus violence plus that trauma, how did that manifest especially over the latter part of the 20th century?
When we think about the great work of one of my favorite writers, Richard Wright, right,
Mm.
from Natchez, Mississippi, landed up in Chicago, and two of his most famous novels, Native Son and
Mhm.
Black Boy, right?
Mhm.
And there's an original manuscript that was called American Hunger, where you're arriving with the violence that you've experienced down south, a system that's wrought, and there's the violence baked in every fabric of this, every step you take is being maintained by this violence. Now you end up in these northern cities with the great hope of promise and opportunity, but you're you're pushed into these slum conditions where red lines are drawn around these communities where that you can't insure your property properly. There are deed of covenants that say, white folks can't sell to black people ever. Your home value is diminished. You're never able to accumulate wealth. You're jammed into these densely populated apartment buildings, where there is no freedom of movement, and then a police force that is there operating as the slave patrols, essentially, keeping black folks penned in, right? And
mm,
with all this, all the while, the hunger burning in the belly for more. And what does it mean to survive? What does it mean to
mhm,
fight for yourselves and your community? And then in the post Brown v. Board of Education years, where you see now a ramping up of the NRA and the pro Second Amendment set, right, as a response to burgeoning American freedom, emboldening and fueling the manufacturers and industry now. And now you have these pipelines of millions of guns, and so many of them being siphoned off into the illegal market, into communities that are already suffering from the violence of hunger, the violence of lack of access to quality health care and education, all those forms of violence that precede gun violence, right? That are requisite in creating the kind of ecosystem that's ripe for that manifestation of the violence. And so
mm.
what we see is a Black America bursting at the seams, fighting for freedom, fighting to survive, while also doing it in conditions, in these slum-like conditions, that are themselves a form of violence.
Right. Yeah, it's America's been a violent country for as long as it's been a nation, and even beforehand. And so gun violence isn't an exclusively black problem. It's not oriented exclusively toward the state or white folks towards black people. So all groups have been victimized by gun violence in one way or another in this country. But all groups don't have the stereotype of being criminally
Yeah.
prone or less intelligent, or these other stereotypes that tend to justify Black people being subjected to violence in ways that other groups don't have to battle. So, can you talk us through the way like stereotypes and social perceptions of Black people compound the gun problem that the nation has writ large?
Think no further than the last few weeks when the President of the United States was threatening to send, federal troops into American cities with big Black
Mm-hmm.
populations. And he said in his press conference, it doesn't matter whether it's 5 years, 10 years, or 2 years, these people, these people are born to be criminal. There is still this notion, I truly believe, that Black people are somehow less human, that we're still something other, and we've accepted that. And so when we hear the language and the rhetoric about needing to bring people to heal and super predators, and this idea that there is something innately violent within us,
Mm-hmm.
part of my hope for this book, one of the messages is that if you want to understand American violence, look at the systems that precede the gun violence. We've become this poster child of the violence, even though we've experienced so many forms of American violence,
Right.
racialized, and it's been accepted and normalized. I think that is the truest and most volatile form of violence. It's the American violence, the racialized violence, before we get to this notion that we're somehow these subhuman savages that need to be brought to heel. And even though we experience gun death and homicide disproportionately, it's an obscenity. 40+% of the homicides in this country, gun deaths, are white, right?
Mm-hmm.
Committed by white people. And so, certainly I'm looking at this through a racialized lens, how this
Mm-hmm.
kind of confluence of race and white supremacy and guns and history collide to how we experience it. That kind of violence is central to the American ethos and, dare we say, American manhood. Right? It's
Right.
sitting side by side. And the idea that the gun has been used to tame the savage land and tame the savage red man and bring
Right.
to heel the savage black man. And this is a symbol of white supremacy. No wonder during those the midnight marauding during the Klan years that they were holding that gun became a symbol of white supremacy
Mm.
and white virility and white manhood. And to this day, there is still an effort to keep black people disarmed because while there is this deep connection to the gun, there still is a fear of an armed black populace.
Right. Yeah, and I haven't done a ton of reading on like the 60s and the 70s, but the idea of like Black Panther Party arming themselves made the federal government very nervous. The Second Amendment didn't become the most important, when then it became uh, essentially, as you said, government exercising and sometimes abusing their power to keep people in check. And yet, this is my sister owns a small business in North Carolina. It's a retail shop, candy apples. And after a few months, she said, "I think I need to get a gun because all it's going to take is somebody to run up here and want to cause me some harm, and I have no way to protect myself." I had a grad student who essentially a drug addict broke into her and her husband's home, and they cornered themselves in a bedroom. Luckily, the police got there before this guy did anything. But afterwards, she went and bought a gun because she said, "I can't wait on the police to protect me." So, what do you make of the increasing ownership of guns by Black Americans today, coupled with this really discordant history that we have with guns, different from the rest of the country? Never mind the whole country's relationship, but our specific one.
I want to like start with, if you have this image in your head of a white kid in wherever getting a rifle for Christmas or his birthday, that doesn't shock us. When we
Right,
see target shooting, or even there's a professional sports league, the shooting sports leagues, we have zero problem with the idea of white people with guns. But when we see black people with guns, it automatically sends up alarms because
mhm,
we're so conditioned to have an unarmed black populace. When
right,
from the very beginning, not only were we agrarian people and peoples who hunted and sought to protect ourselves during the worst of times, but think about those 300,000 black men who served in the Union Army, who
right.
returned with their rifles, who defended their communities from the Klan and these paramilitary organizations, or much later, the Deacons of Defense, who protected Dr. King and those civil rights activists, or even the Tulsa Race Massacre, when it was World War I black male veterans who were the first ones with their rifles to take the hill and to try to defend their communities. And so
Mm,
it's not as if black folks don't have the same impulse of self-defense and protection as white folks. In fact, if there is a population of people who might need some
right,
protection, it's
right,
black folks. Because I've been at every major rebellion and uprising in the last 15 and 20 years, from Ferguson on. And if you ever want to witness the disparity in the way we view who's using the force and who's having the force used upon them of guns, look at how police respond to protesters when they know they're not armed.
right.
They have their they have their assault rifles, they have their snipers, they have their rubber bullets, their flashbangs, all of this violence. But lest we forget, maybe what, 15, 20 years ago, the Bundy Ranch takeover, when
Mm,
folks took over the Bundy Ranch and federal agents in Nevada, and federal agents came to respond, and those white boys had those guns aimed at those officers' head. Now it's time for a conversation.
mm,
And so, with this book, what I'm trying to do is speak to all of these dynamics. And
mhm,
certainly, even in that desire to defend ourselves, I do believe that gun ownership brings you closer to early death either way, from someone
mm.
else's or your own. And so, I'm not advocating the gun, but this is how we've experienced the gun and the many forms of violence that comes from it.
Right. Wow. Well, talked about, in your heart attack afterwards, like you have a new lease on life, new health habits. You were trying to make sure like this doesn't happen again. And I wonder if you could talk about how, sort of draw the same comparison between how that experience changed how you take care of yourself now, both physically and mentally, emotionally, spiritually, etc. And what that means for sort of the Black body politic. How do we address this trauma that we had no part in integrating into in our being, but we are responsible for coping with, for managing, and for what we pass on to our children. So, what's life after this health scare, and then how does that translate to better health habits, for lack of a better term, for the Black body politic and the trauma that we inherit.
We most certainly are not the violence that we experience, right? we
Mm-hmm.
we somehow have been treated as if we brought this on ourselves. And part of what I'm trying to do is an historical resetting to understand the true dynamics. I think it was so important for me in the moments of clarity that I had post heart attack and getting my physical self healthy, my mental and emotional and spiritual self healthy, is being able to point to the trauma and name the trauma so that we can break it up in real time and recognize that it is not our fault with these big historical gaps and these big gaps in how we're viewed as full humans. In those gaps, all kind of stuff is projected in there. The stereotypes, it's all projected in there. And sometimes we own that too. And so I think it's important for us to understand the truth about how we arrive in this moment, recognizing what trauma is and how it affects us, our attitudes, right, our sleep,
Mhm.
and then finding healthy ways to cope. So for me, in this moment of like, oh my goodness, I understand what this is for me. Being mindful, learning mindfulness and meditation, and the idea that to be around, you got to be around, right? You got to be healthy. You want to be there for the kids. You want to be there for your spouse. You want to be there for your community. You have to do everything possible to actually physically be here. And that
Mhm.
means part of it is understanding that everything is not always going to be the way we planned, but it's always going to be all right. We've been through
Mhm.
we've been through much. And there is something we can do about, not denying those pieces that are weighing us down or that rock in your gut. I know for me, I was taking every story, every headline, every tear, and packing it away, and then pretending that as if it didn't exist. I moved on, right? I tried to
Mhm.
move on, even though at night I'm seeing the ribbons of this murder or this kid who got shot in the head or the body. The body.
Mhm.
I remember when I was a young journalist arriving at crime scenes and seeing a young man, literally my age, dead from gunshot wounds. And that was my job to show up every single day at these crime scenes. And I had a police scanner over my shoulder, and so I would know it's time to go. And arriving to see the bodies and the pain reflected in the neighbors' eyes and the parents' eyes and the mothers and fathers and all that,
Mhm.
and having to ask for yearbook pictures and having to go through all the processes of committing acts of journalism, right? But never fully breaking that down. And so now it's like if I need to take a step back, I need to take a step back. If I need to breathe,
Mhm.
I need to breathe. If I need to meditate, right? Or pray or whatever it is to get in sync. And I think those are lessons Black folks in general can use because there are so many big and small forms of violence that we just weather every single day, whether it's
Mhm.
blood clot or the bullet, both shredding life, right? Whether it's an issue with a police officer or your boss at work in these
Right.
white that we operate in, and what it means to be strong and do your job, and also weather these slights and how am I going to respond, and the tension therein, as we know,
Mhm.
how do I respond to this guy who just says something slick, and I
Right.
know what he's saying, and that tension of you can't trip, I'm at work. You Ted, you got to do your thing. I'm like, I can't, you can't worry about that
Right.
all tension and grief. So I think we need to like recognize it for what it is, and it's not normal, and it's not natural, and we didn't bring this onto ourselves.
Right. Right. And so, for those watching, please begin to submit some questions that we can discuss here, and you can do that again through the Q&A box in the Slido piece there. And so, I almost want to like stay on this point a little bit around. Oh, so then, how do we tell the story of gun violence if exposure to it um, almost exacerbates our vulnerability to it? And I think I mean, among the many things the book does really well, it tells us, it shows us, it demonstrates that gun violence doesn't stop at whoever the bullet hits. Gun violence impacts the family, the community, the people, the country. And so, how do we tell these stories of violence without um, sort of holding that violence in our chests? I know there's not a foolproof way to do it, but there's certainly got to be some best practices. I imagine Ida B. Wells, for example, covering lynchings. I can't imagine the kind of trauma that happens from the visual, and then having to tell America about what you saw to sort of bear witness to it.
Yeah. I think it's two things. I think on one hand, um, because it's so normalized and we've accepted some degree of Black suffering and Black pain, it's important that everybody has to hold a little piece of it. No, 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 no.
Hmm.
We're all part of this. If this woman is hurting, no, no, no. You need to understand your role in this, and your
Hmm.
the policies you support and the politicians you support and how you engage with the gun. And that's one thing. So I think it's important for some people because that was also for white folks to see what's happening down here. The same way with the civil
Hmm.
rights movement. Let's show a picture to America of what American violence actually looks like. So that's
Hmm.
that part. I think for us, um, in one hand, we're holding the precarity of life, and the other, the preciousness of life. And why this hurts so bad is because of the beauty, right? And the love
Hmm.
and the
Hmm.
folkways and tradition and the way that we've made out of no way, that we made a way out of no way and created
Hmm.
everything you love about America. right? We've created everything we love about America. And so reminding ourselves of the reason we have to make sure we defend and protect life and make sure that we're healthy is because of our great promise. Because our promise has not been fulfilled yet.
That's
All
right.
nation building and institution building and forcing America to be the purest, best version of itself because they never wanted it to be a government full of equality, right?
Right.
And rights and access. It was never meant to be that. And so we push that. And so I think it's a reminder of like, we have to see this pain because we need to find a way to end it. We need to
Mhm.
stop it. We have to understand how it's impacting us and that it's not normal and it's not okay. And let's point to the source. Let's point to the
Mhm.
source to unburden yourself from some of it. That does not mean we shouldn't hold ourselves accountable. Folks need to be held accountable for acts of violence, etc. I think there's a conversation among Black men in particular, like how do we protect ourselves and our communities, right?
Right.
How do we continue to show up for each other in a way that is liberation and freedom minded, right? And family
Mhm.
minded. How do we do that in healthy ways? Um, and so I think it's a tough balance, but I think it's always rooted. And you'll see it through the book. It's like we arrive in Chicago, and there's the beauty of Chicago, and here's
Mhm.
what's chipping around the edges. You get to New Orleans. Here's what New Orleans is and what we've created, despite the force against us. But here are the mechanisms at work
Mhm.
against us. The
Mhm.
migration, right? What it means to the immigrants are, you know what it takes to pack up and go to a foreign place and
Right.
make a way where you don't understand either the little language or the cultural language, and there's no guarantees, right? Who we are, and then the bravery of those who remained in the South to deal
Right.
with the last vestiges of this flailing, violent society bent on
Right.
your breaking, what that means. And so it's always a blend between the brutality, but also the beauty, and that's why that hurts so much, and that's why we need to address it.
Mhm. Uh-huh. Now you were on the ground for like when Trayvon Martin was killed, you were one of the first folks there reporting on it. And when Michael Brown was killed, you were one of the first folks there. And in my mind, I mean, this may be a little revisionist because there are so many incidents of either vigilante or police violence against Black men in particular at the time, but Black people generally. But those two, Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, were the two that really kicked off this, like the Black Lives Matter movement, and a nation paying more attention, and certainly the media paying more attention to these instances of violence against unarmed Black people. And I wonder if now 10 years after, yeah, 2015, so over 10 years later, do you see a difference in the America pre Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown when it comes to race and guns, and the America we have today? Is today worse? Is today about the same? I wonder how you compare those two periods after we've lived through this decade of racialized gun violence, in a distinct way from maybe the 2000s or the 90s.
I think we have post Trayvon and post Mike Brown. I think we have a language to use, right? I think there are mechanisms to organize that we didn't have before. That people can stand up and push back and fight and rally in a way that I don't remember. I mean, you had Rev Sharpton and a bunch of folks hyper
Mhm.
local in the 80s. Um, but to see this kind of robust connection. Um, but in recent years, and I don't have the stats for last year, but in 2022 and 2023, we had more police killed more people than ever before, set new records
Mm.
each year, right? So
Mm.
so post the mass movement around George Floyd, post the architecture erected after Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown and Ferguson, and the anger of Ferguson, but the fiery anger, right, of how we experience these kinds of state murders. Um, but then the police are still as active as ever. Yet if you turn the TV on, you wouldn't know it. You
Right.
wouldn't know it. And so I think in some ways, again, we have the architecture and language that's changed, and I think young people know that they can. But on the other hand, the system does what the system does, and you're
Right.
dealing with violent, societies that ever existed. And so it's yeah, I don't know if we're better or worse, but here we
Yeah.
are. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the big policy demands coming out of especially the early years of the Black Lives Matter movement, were to have police wear body cameras, with the idea that once they know that there's recordings of what they're doing, they'll stop doing all the bad stuff. And to your point, they didn't think they were doing bad stuff. That's why their behavior doesn't change when the camera's on, because they actually don't think they're violating policy, law, or people's human or civil rights. Um,
And they're not,
so
and they're not because it's baked in policy.
that's right. That's right.
The,
To
the,
your point,
the,
right?
the
Right.
number of dogs, and this is one of those this is one of those kind of stats, and I don't have the exact stat in front of me, but the disproportionate number of Black people who are bitten by police dogs. And it
Mm,
sounds like, oh, some dogs, a German Shepherd tearing into your flesh
right.
for what? It's the level of violence that we accept in this country is a travesty and obscene, man.
Yeah. Yeah. We got a question from the audience. How can we continue addressing anti-Black racism in professional and academic settings as these topics are increasingly deemed as taboo by the presidential administration?
That is a big one, especially with the administration, because as we've seen all of the promises fade from the post George Floyd universe, and all
Mm,
those promises, all those corporations who promised to fund these programs and everything. Now they've going back to their default baseline position, and they're lining up at the White House to kiss the ring and do
right.
whatever we have to do, boss. And so we think about the hypocrisy and the blatant lies, and it has created such a dangerous environment for those who do want to speak up because you really don't know how your bosses actually feel or
Hmm.
the corporate heads. Let's look at what's happening with Nexstar and ABC and all this other stuff happening is
Hmm.
you can't trust it. But I think the best thing folks can do is to not just organize in spaces, but organize in spaces. But also those of us who are journalists, especially and writers, especially, it's incumbent upon us to keep telling the truth and leaving a
Hmm.
record. So at least there's a playbook for people to be armed with the truth, the historical, accurate truth, and armed with that honesty, right?
Hmm.
In this storm of lies and misrepresentations and miseducations, all the misses, that we
Right.
leave something that this generation and the next can study from. I think
Hmm.
I think that's the only thing we can do because there will be a time where this too shall pass, as my late grandmother would say. Um,
Hmm.
time organize and tell the truth.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the role of faith in and I mean there because the picture you paint is a dire one, but there's still optimism sort of and how you think about the way through this. So and you've mentioned your grandmother a couple times. It sounds like there's a heavy if your grandmother's like mine, church. There,
Right.
a scripture for everything. Jesus
Right.
was everywhere and was always listening. How did faith shape your ability to sort of manage the trauma that happens both health wise, but also with guns, um, and then being able to see a light or at least continue the fight.
Yeah, faith plays an important, like not I want to say central role, but it's a very important role in this book and telling this story,
Hmm.
and a broader story of what we've experienced in this country. And I think I have a complicated relationship with faith. I have a deep faith and a deep connection to spirit and soul. Like I have a deep connection to it. But far too often, Black folks have had to use and lean on faith where policy should be the barrier, where policy
Mm,
should be there, but we have to rely on faith in the face of grotesque lynchings and dismemberments and bodies being burned and police shooting us and dogs biting us and being denied all the things. And this conditional citizenship and this partial
mhm,
half-ass citizenship that we experience. Yet we've always believed in a time, a greater time, right? A promised time. And that's the only way I believe we've gotten through any of this is through great faith, that through sheer will and sheer determination and sheer belief that there are better days and brighter days to come. I don't know of another peoples who could experience what we've
that's
experienced
right. I'm with
because of
you.
our peculiar collision of factors of what we came with, what we
Hmm.
made out of what we found when we got here, what was forced on us, all those things coming together to create, our faith traditions and our church traditions,
Right.
and our homegoings, and even the way we bury our
Yes.
dead. That there is something greater beyond this, and there's a place for you, right? And so I think but it's a tough one, but I think I think about the Buffalo church shooting and Mother Emanuel in Charleston and
That's right.
forgiveness in the wake of such horrific that these killers, um, sought these places because they knew who was there. Faithful people. You're going to a church, a Black church. You're going to a Black community in Buffalo. You drive 4 hours because you know you'll find community there and elders
Mhm.
there. Yet still, Black folks have found a way to weather it and to believe and still show up at church. And as my grandmother would say, I'm blessed by the best, right? Like I tell my grandmother and what she experienced, but she's blessed by the best. Uh,
Mm,
and so I think there's great power in that. But again, I still, it bothers me that we have to forgive and we have to move forward and we have to, turn to, and some people are turning to a Jesus that looks Norwegian, right? Some people are turning to super white Jesus, blonde hair, blue eyes, like the fakest Jesus possibly. Um, but we find faith where because God is God. Many of us believe that God is God, regardless of whatever narrative is, but God is still God.
that's
Um,
right.
so,
Yeah, one of the definitions in political science of a nation state is a nation state is a place that has a monopoly on violence.
mhm.
And so, the other part of the Bible says an eye for an eye.
Yeah.
But when the state has a monopoly on violence, there is no eye for an eye. That people, especially an already oppressed, subjugated group of people, don't have the luxury of. I mean, Nat Turner. We have evidence of what happens when Black folks try to meet violence with violence. The response isn't just to the actors. The response is to the entire group wherever they are, and as you talked about, that's part of the American story. That's part of our lineage. And so I wonder, in your reporting, in your research, did you come across a place that actually was getting it right on guns, or a community, whether it was using restorative justice to try to heal wounds, or red flag laws to get more guns out of people's hands? I just wonder if there were any instances of people who understood the phenomena that you describe in the book and turned to either policy or community practice to try to you know usher folks through this time, or through these experiences.
There are many. I don't know if I have come across somewhere that gets it right in the blending
Hmm.
of all those, the cultural aspects, social, all that stuff, and then policy stuff. But what we do know is where there are cities and states that have higher access to guns, easier access to guns, there is more gun homicide and gun death.
Hmm.
So there are cities and states that have stricter gun laws, where you would presume you'd have less homicides and gun violence, except for the fact the Swiss cheese nature of gun laws in this country. There are these pipelines going from,
Right.
easy to get states like Mississippi into tougher ones like Chicago. But I think when we look at, say, Baltimore has seen this tremendous decline in homicides, as have
Right.
a few other cities. And what people have been doing is targeting those most likely, um, to commit violence or be a victim of violence. And then you get resources to those people because in
Mm.
well-fed communities, you don't have the same level of gun violence. Where the income and wealth gaps are slimmer, you don't have that kind of gun violence, right? You just don't have those things. And so what it
Mhm.
is, as long as we're not presuming that there's something wrong with these individual humans, but the conditions that they exist in, um, I think that's the move, and that's where you get it right. Also understanding, this idea of trauma-informed care, that when you're engaging with population and community, you understand what they're experiencing. And so if you're in Pick a City, USA, and a 15-year-old gets caught with a gun, no violent record, he lives in a community where people are getting shot every day.
Right.
And so that same impulse of I'm a shop owner. What if something happens? I need to be able to defend myself. That 15-year-old also has that impulse
Mm.
because in his situation, people are literally getting shot every single day. And so we have to understand what we're dealing with. And going back to that idea, you said something I think we take for granted, that the state has this monopoly on violence and power. They can kill you. They can cage you. If it's on camera, I feared for my life. He
Right.
didn't. He didn't. It was regardless of whether the stop was legal or not or
Right.
constitutional. He made me feel nervous. He reached around. A furtive movement. Stop and
Mm.
frisk. Right. And this is normalized. Right. Every few years it'll flare up politically. But this stuff is normalized. So but I think the places that are doing it best, are focusing on the whole human. And again,
Yeah.
they're arriving understanding the trauma.
Hmm. And do you think there's a generational, or maybe I should ask you, what is the generational differences between, say, we're Gen Xers, but Gen Z has a different relationship with guns. School shootings wasn't really a thing in our America in the 80s. It is now. I mean, we were had a little bit of exposure to hip hop violence, Biggie and Tupac, and kids today are seeing rap stars being taken up. But I wonder maybe, through your daughter's eyes or through your reporting, how their Black children, Black Gen Z, their relationship to guns is, and whether it's, how it differs from our generation and older.
You know what's most concerning, and this is answering your question, but it's also a little different. Um,
Hmm.
because of social media and this false sense of connection and network, we're seeing a whole slew of indicators um, trending in some pretty good ways. Less drinking, less teen
Right.
pregnancy, less underage sex and disease, like all kinds, because they're not engaging with each other, right? So they're not doing risky behavior because they're not around each other. But then that disconnection, when you think about young Black men, especially who are already feeling socially and economically isolated, we've seen the suicide rate jump dramatically in recent years, which
Hmm.
used to be thought to be and was the domain of white men and white
Hmm.
boys. Now we're seeing this rise. And so the nature of where the violence is being directed, I think, is shifting a bit. There's certainly still young people killing young people, um, but I think not dissimilar to what a source told me many years ago about some of the violence we see in urban youth. It also is actually a suicide. It's actually self-destruction. So they're running
Hmm.
towards the bullets in a different way. And so in one way,
Hmm.
young men have always been restless because they feel desperate and isolated. But I think what we're seeing now, that rise in gun suicides, that is concerning about how there's a
Hmm.
redirection among this younger cohort towards themselves. That's very troubling.
Yeah. Yeah, and I also want to sort of ask a masculinity, a gender question, sort of like the generational one. Um, I mean, guns read masculine, and most of the perpetrators of gun violence are men. But there's something about the power of the gun that codes super masculine or hyper masculine, and also the masculinity sort of being on trial if in the country today. That it's evolving. There's toxic versions. There's sort of traditional versions that are maybe conservative that are also seen as out of step and no longer culturally acceptable. And so I just wonder how masculinity plays into Black folks' relationship with guns, and the violence and trauma that are associated.
Just like most other men in this country, well, we recognize or we don't how central the gun is to the masculine American ethos. From
Mhm.
John Wayne to even the way we romanticize gangsters, right? And Scarface. And
Right.
the mafia and mob, they're celebrated because they're cool and they're masculine, right? And I
Mhm.
think young Black men haven't also been able to peel ourselves away from it. But there's also the reality of what it means to be able to instantaneously take a life,
Mm.
take a life, or the threat of that. There is real power in that, real
Mhm.
power in that. And I don't think we've been able to properly interrogate um, the role of gun and masculine and manhood in a way that makes anything any clearer because we are having this conversation about the limitations on manhood, and
Right.
for far too long all you needed is brute force and violence. But then also, that's how our policy works abroad. That's how it works everywhere.
Right.
Threat
Right.
of brute force and violence and death, and that we can take your lives.
Right.
It'll take a push of a button. We have drones
Right.
that will explode in your back. We could put a missile in your bathroom window, the size of
Mm.
it. And so it's how do we um, properly interrogate it when you know not only was this country built in that violence, but we continue to move that way.
Yeah. Yeah. We're bumping up right against time here, and so first of all, if y'all have not yet read the book, I would commend you to pick it up. This is it is both a history of Black people's relationship with guns in America and a story about how that history is carried in our bodies and passed on. And there's just not another book that makes an argument in this way. And so I would encourage you to pick it up. What's the message you leave folks with? To they've now taken all this in. They've learned a lot. They understand epigenetics certainly more, and have a tangible set of experiences based on your family's memoir and your own on how that affects folks, societies, and beyond. What's the next step? What's the takeaway? What's the to do for folks who are newly enlightened by what you've written about here?
Yeah. If you want to understand how we got here, and you want to understand the breadth of Black life and death, um, the central idea is that there's nothing wrong with us, that understanding the violence that's precipitated our experience here won't answer and solve, right?
Right,
If you want to understand how we've experienced violence in a particular way, this is a, an historical resetting to fully
right.
understand how we got here. And so I hope that folks see this as both a memorial and a mirror. A
Mm,
memorial for all that's been taken, all that's been lost, but also a mirror to reflect on who we are as a country and how and to whom we've deployed violence. Um,
mhm.
but to say it super plain, Black folks ain't nothing wrong with us.
That's right.
Ain't nothing
We
wrong
ain't
with us. We ain't broken.
we
You want
ain't
to
broke.
understand? You want to understand what's broken? Look around us. Look at the machinery built around us.
Right,
And
right.
and as much as this is, I had to stop saying it's ostensibly about guns and gun violence because it is. But the gun and gun violence, it's a vehicle to have a conversation about American violence,
Mhm.
right? And how much of it has been
Right.
accepted, and how we hopefully can see the beauty in our fellow humans and the
Right.
humanity in us, to try to do something better,
Mhm.
and to heal and heal. And it's about healing.
That's it. Yes, yes. To heal. Um, Speaking of which, how are you feeling, brother? You know, life is good and living the dream and bringing the story to the world, man.
I'm in such a spirit of gratitude and gratefulness
Mhm.
and thankfulness. Um, like saying these words, I almost could cry now because I feel like there were so many times, you've written a book, there's so many times where my life could have went various
Right.
directions.
Right.
And I sit back and it's not just about the awards, like Pulitzer, Emmy, it's not just about that, but it's like I've made a way coming from whence I came and my people came, having
Mm.
weathered so much, and that I can tell my people's story, like my
Right.
family story, but also my people's story, and that we
Right.
deserve so much more than this. Um, and I feel healthy. I feel like yesterday we got word that I'm finally a national bestseller. This is a USA Today
Oh, wow.
bestseller.
Congratulations, man.
Thank you. So I'm like, people are actually reading the book, and
Wow.
the critics have been very kind. The reviews have been great, and to open my chest up and be vulnerable and pour my entire self onto the page in a way that I
Mm.
never planned or expected to. I'm just and having a conversation like this, man, like it just means everything to me.
Yeah.
It means a lot to me, man. First of all, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, brother. We appreciate you. We're glad you're here to write this book, and thank you for all the lessons in it and the message you have for the country. The book is A Thousand Ways to Die, Tremaine Lee. Go get it. And thank you, brother, for sharing your story and for the book.
Thank you, good brother. Appreciate you.
Yeah, best of luck.
Thank you.
And thank y'all for watching. This is New America.